Hello, good afternoon, everyone. This is Robbie Diamond. Thank you so much for joining us for this edition of our Safe Watch series. Now for something a little bit different, which is a little bit of fiction, although it's so close to reality and some of the things we've been working on at Safe that maybe we won't believe it's total fiction by the end. But I'm excited to have Admiral Jim Stavridis and Elliott Ackerman, who are the authors of 2034. It does feel like a bit of a family affair here in that Admiral Stavridis is on our Energy Security Leadership Council. Elliott Ackerman is the progeny of a member of our Energy Security Leadership Council. And we are all graduates of the Fletcher School, and some of us actually ran the school, but are all affiliated in some way to the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. So this is all very exciting. First, let me introduce our two speakers. Admiral Jim Stavridis was a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy. He served for 37 years. He was the 16th Supreme Allied Commander, always the greatest title ever given to anybody. He also was a commander of the U.S. Southern Command, the 12th Dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Of course, won countless medals, but also ran a destroyer squadron and a carrier strike group, which might be relevant to some of the story we read. And he is the author of 10 books. Elliott Ackerman is an American author. Few authors you meet in life are compared to Ernest Hemingway several times and in the New York Review of Books. He was an 8-year Marine Corps infantry and special operations officer. He won both the Purple Heart in Iraq and the Silver Star in Afghanistan. I got to read his citation, or his father also read me the citation. And you know, it's very rare you meet people like that, and it's really an honor. He is the author of 4 novels and 1 memoir, and a finalist in the National Book Award in 2017. There's also something about Elliott is that see this book, Waiting for Eden, which is one of his books. I think of Elliott every morning because my wife has a leather couch. And after I read this book and I needed something to put my hot cup of coffee on so I wouldn't make a stain, somehow his book became my book. So every morning at about 5:50 a.m., I look at Elliott's name and I know all about Elliott. So it's a great book. I really encourage you to read. And it's also a great coffee coaster. Okay. So now let's go to the questions. Thank you both for joining us.
Pleasure to be with you.
Thanks, Robbie.
No problem. So, sorry, Elliot, I didn't mean to. I hope that's okay that I use your book for that.
The greatest thing an author can aspire to is to create a great work of literature and a great coaster. So I take the praise. Thank you, Robbie.
It's like in Seinfeld, the coaster book. So why don't we start with the book, and why don't we go to, why did you write the book? Maybe start with Admiral Stavridis. How did you get to this place, and why this book?
Well, it's a book about the future. It's set in 2034, obviously, but I began by looking to the past. And I thought about Cold War literature. So think Tom Clancy, Red Storm Rising, Sir John Hackett, The Third World War, Fail Safe, The Bedford Incident, films like Dr. Strangelove and On the Beach. There was this very rich body of kind of cautionary literature that helped us imagine how terrible a war would be between the United States and the Soviet Union. And I think that helped prevent it. It gave context. It gave pause to policymakers, I believe, on both sides of the Atlantic. So with that in mind, I looked to the future and sort of hypothesized that there isn't a similar body of literary writing about what a war between the United States and China would look like. So with that as a frame, I went to my editor, who turns out is Elliott's editor at Penguin Press, Random House, and I pitched him on it. And he said, Stavridis, you're a great guy. You've written 9 books. You're not a novelist, but we know a novelist. And he surfaced Elliott's name, which of course put a big smile on my face. You spoke about our Fletcher School connection. And I'll let Elliott pick up the story from there.
Yeah, sure. The Admiral and I knew each other from Fletcher. When he was the dean at the Fletcher School, he invited me to serve as the writer in residence for a semester. And when he sent me over a list of my duties, one of the bullet points was to talk with the dean about books whenever he feels like it. So we had spent time, discussing books, literature. I think very much we're familiar with one another's sensibilities, and as you mentioned, had this shared editor. So we had almost a decades-long friendship that predated this project. When the prospect was sort of floated to me about collaborating with Jim on this book, it was very exciting. We talked about what it would be, the idea that would be engaging with, obviously geopolitical themes, but be trying to tell a character-driven story. There was just complete alignment from the outset on that. And so we said, well, let's see if we can write a first chapter. And we set to the work and found out that we could, and the rest of the book came from there.
Hey, I got something I want to add to that, since you're holding up copies of Elliott's books. This is Elliott's first novel. As you can see, the title is Green on Blue, and it's set in Afghanistan. And on the back of it, I just want to read you one of these blurbs. This is the best novel of the Afghan-Iraq wars to date, striking a lyrical chord akin and equal in power to Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls. This fearless and pitch-perfect first novel is a heartbreaking wonder. That blurb was written by Admiral James Stavridis. So I sign up to Robbie's comments, and I hope I was among the first to identify this enormous talent that we're sharing a stage with.
This is the circle of life. That's what we'll talk about now. So we're going to talk about 2034, where we are today, maybe things that will happen in between now and 2034. But why don't we, before we go to the real world, why don't we turn to Elliot for a moment and maybe have Elliot go through maybe a little of the characters of the book and tell the story of the book itself for people who haven't read it without giving it away.
Sure, absolutely. So as we mentioned, this book is very much, it's a character-driven book, and there's really 5 central characters who take you into the narrative. So the book opens in the South China Sea, which I'm sure all of you know is a body of water that is as large as half of the continental United States. Just a vast body of water that China currently claims as territorial waters. And that is obviously disputed by the international community. And as such, today, the United States Navy and the navies of our allies, we sail what are called freedom of navigation patrols through the South China Sea as a way to assert that they are, in fact, international waters. So the novel opens on the bridge of the USS John Paul Jones, which is the flagship of Commodore Sarah Hunt, who is leading a 3-ship patrol through the South China Sea. And Commodore Hunt spies a fishing trawler, a Chinese fishing trawler that appears to be in duress with smoke billowing off of its bridge. And she takes her ships closer to investigate and quickly discovers that it's anything but a commercial fishing trawler. Now, cut to halfway around the world, over the Straits of Hormuz, where our second central character, Marine Major Chris Wedge Mitchell, a 4th-generation Marine fighter pilot. His father flew in Iraq and Afghanistan. His grandfather flew dropping Snake and Nape in Vietnam. And his great-grandfather flew on the wing of Pappy Boynton in the South Pacific. And now we meet Wedge, who is flying his state-of-the-art F-35 strike fighter right up against the edge of Iranian airspace, with basically his starboard wing just kind of lacing the side of that barrier. And he is sitting in his cockpit, frankly, lamenting that he's not really flying at all, that he feels sort of like a cheap token of a pilot because technology has become so advanced that these aircraft seem to fly themselves. And just as he's sort of lamenting this fact, his aircraft does in fact begin to fly itself. Control is taken away from him, and it diverts eastward right into Iranian airspace on a descent path toward Bandar Abbas airfield. Now cut to internal the White House, where we meet the 3rd principal character of the book, which is Dr. Sandeep Sandy Chowdhury, a first-generation Indian American who works on the National Security Council staff. He is also, like the three of us, a very proud graduate of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, but he has got a crisis on his hands. In fact, dual crises, as he's trying to manage what's going on in the South China Sea, as well as what's going on over the Straits of Hormuz with this aircraft that has lost control. At which time his phone starts ringing. When he answers the phone, the fourth principal character of the novel is on the line. And that is Admiral Lin Bao, the military attaché from China to the United States. And Admiral Lin Bao has a very succinct for Sandy Chowdhury. And that is that these two events, what's going on in the South China Sea and what's going on above the Strait of Hormuz, are interrelated, and that the Chinese government is no longer going to stand idly by while the United States drives its ships back and forth through the South China Sea. At that time, Admiral Lin Bao delivers a message, and that message takes the form of a cyber attack, where in effect, the entire eastern seaboard of the United States is blinked. And the lights go off, the power goes off, and it comes right back on. But when it comes back on, everything isn't working as it did before. And so I would be remiss, that's the end of the first chapter of the book, but I didn't mention just the fifth principal character he meets at the beginning of the second chapter, and that is Brigadier Qasim Farshad. So when Wedge lands on the tarmac at Bandar Abbas, there is a grizzled 20-plus year veteran of our forever wars waiting to meet him, although he fought on the opposite side of those wars in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria, and that is Qasim Farshad. And so he takes control of Wedge. And so now the board has been set with its pieces, and you as the reader are taken into the world of 2034 as these two crises escalate into a global war. So that's kind of the book.
Now, the thing about SAFE is we actually started, I don't know if you both know this, by a scenario called Oil Shockwave, where we brought together a cabinet of former cabinet members. So we very much, are in this world of trying to think ahead. And actually our third turn in the scenario was in the South China Seas. This is 2005, and people thought we were crazy. And here we are in 2034, it leads to this global war. So do you think 2034 is too close, though? Like, it's always hard to choose the date. Too far away doesn't seem realistic, but too close, many things have to happen and only 12, 13 years away.
I'll take that one. And Robbie, please direct traffic and ask who you would like to answer the question. But I'll jump on that one and simply say, I've gotten a lot of wonderful feedback from close friends, contemporaries, retired, active duty, four-star military, policymakers, former cabinet officials. In fact, two of the blurbs on the back of the book are by Jim Mattis and by Bob Gates. And the general consensus is, hey, Stavridis, you guys wrote a pretty good book here, but you got one big thing wrong. And it's not cyber or driverless cars or the role of India. The big thing we got wrong, according to a lot of people, is the date. And a lot of people are saying it is much sooner. Now, that's an interesting point because, as I'll let Elliot explain, we actually started further out, but events kind of walked back. Elliot?
I would only add, all of the books that I've worked on have kind of come generally in one of two forms. One where the title is immediately apparent from the outset of the project, and the other was when the title is not revealed until much later. And I would say 2034 certainly falls into the latter category, in so much as, we had a few titles that we were playing around with going into this project, but as we were writing it, we hadn't necessarily fixed the date. The more we got in depth in the scenario and the more we started gaming it through and imagining it, it was almost like the date was like a tide that was kind of coming up the beach towards our feet, getting closer and closer and closer. And by the time we were pretty far along in this book and almost finished with it, we'd done so much talking about the date and, putting different numbers on different drafts that we realized that the date itself, 2034, was in fact the title of the book.
Wow, that's incredible and quite scary. So let's go. We will go back to the book, but let's go to the real world.
Hey, Robbie, can I add one thing from the real world in this regard, which is the current four-star commander of the United States Indo-Pacific Command. In other words, the four-star admiral who's in command of all Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, Coast Guard. The big guy at the moment, his name is Admiral Phil Davidson. He just testified in open session in front of the Congress and was asked a question about South China Sea, war with China. Could it happen? He said within the next 6 years, he could easily see China making a move on Taiwan, which I think is the general consensus of what would spark this thing. So this is not just a retired admiral and a former Marine captain, with their overheated imagination. This officer, Admiral Phil Davidson, has access to the highest information and intelligence the United States has to offer. And he gets up every single morning thinking about, could today be the day? Are we going to fight tonight, as the saying goes? So yeah, it's quite sobering when you examine all that together. And the bottom line here, staying in the real world, is the question you want to be asking is, how do we avoid it? And we could talk about that as our webinar goes along. But the bottom line is, to avoid it, you got to imagine it, and then you got to reverse engineer it back to the present so that you can avoid it.
Right. So why don't we take a moment and give us some of the flashpoints in the real world, Admiral Stavridis, that you see now with China, and where you think, lay out the chess pieces in not just the book, but what's going on now.
Unfortunately, this is a bit of a shopping list, so I'm going to go through them pretty quickly. Top of my list is China's claims of ownership of the entire South China Sea. This is an enormous body of water. Maybe some of the listeners aren't aware of this, but it is the size of half of the continental United States of America. It's huge. It's the size of the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean combined. So enormous body of water. China claims it as a territorial sea, meaning that they would own it just as we own the 12 miles of our territorial sea off the coast of California, for example. So this would be perhaps the largest maritime land grab in history if China were allowed to claim it. And by the way, the case has gone to the international courts. It's been resoundingly defeated. In my view, as a dean of a graduate school of law and diplomacy, and my own PhD, by the way, is in the Law of the Sea Treaty, it's a preposterous claim, in my view. China believes it with deep conviction. So that's kind of the top of the list, because we're not going to back down, and I don't think they're going to back down. Taiwan is probably the next most significant flashpoint. And people say, oh, Taiwan's this little island. Hey, Taiwan is a pretty big island, but most importantly, the island of Taiwan is roughly the 35th largest economy in the world. Out of 200 countries, Taiwan would be 30 to 35. It's a big economy. It's a semiconductor hub of the world. It's got a population of 32 million, a proud independent tradition culturally. It's a pretty big disagreement there about whether China ought to be able to simply take over Taiwan. Then you get to the Uyghurs, probably 1 million Uyghurs who are Muslims practicing in the Xinjiang province of China. The way they are treated has been called by many a genocide, re-education camps, forced sterilization. How about the top of the Himalaya mountains where Chinese soldiers are battling with Indian soldiers, are one of our partners, India? How about the dispute between China and Japan over the Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea? How about China's sponsorship of North Korea? All of China's sponsorship of North Korea, all of those ought to give us pause, Robbie. And that is before we had the COVID-19 come out of China, which adds a certain disagreeable set of premises between these two powers. So it's a very rich basket of disagreement, including trade and tariffs. and everything else I said. So these are real flashpoints. We have deep disagreements with China. We ought to seek zones of cooperation, things like climate, things like preparing for the next pandemic. There are certain vested interests that we can build on for some level of cooperation. But unfortunately, at the moment, disagreements outweigh agreements significantly.
But they seem so fundamentally unresolvable, as you said. I mean, take the South China Seas or Taiwan. I mean, is it not inevitable that there is that clash? Or you said, how do we walk ourselves, out of it? Let's go Admiral Stavridis, and then, maybe some thoughts from Elliot.
I don't think it's inevitable, but history certainly ought to give us pause. You're probably familiar with Graham Allison's book, Destined for War: Can America and China Avoid the Thucydides Trap? Graham looked at 18 instances in human history going back to the ancient Greeks. I know this is true because I'm ancient and I'm a Greek American. Sparta and Athens, whenever a rising power is challenging an established power in human history, over those 18 times, in a dozen of them, war has ensued. So 2/3 chance. Last time this happened, by the way, about 100 years ago, Great Britain, established power, challenged by the Kaiser's Germany, rising power. How'd that turn out? World War I, you can drop a plumb line through the Great Depression to World War II, off to the races in the bloodiest century in human history. So history ought to give us pause, along with that list of disagreements. So long way of saying, I think we can still avoid it, but it's going to require efforts on both sides. It's going to require the United States to have a plan to avoid a war without completely caving in to Chinese demands. I like to say we need to bend the relationship with China, but hopefully avoid breaking it. And that's going to require some level of military deterrence, some level of re-onshoring our economies, some level of trade and tariffs, some level of cultural engagement, track to university, finding zones of cooperation like climate, as I mentioned, perhaps pandemic. It's got to be a plan, a coherent plan. And I give the Trump administration credit for correctly seeing the challenge, the looming tower, but they never got to the point of developing a real plan. I think that's got to be job one for the Biden administration. Once they get through the pandemic and the economy, the big international challenge is generating a strategic plan that will bend that relationship with China without breaking it.
Elliot, let me rephrase the question slightly for you, or maybe come to a different answer, which is, you fought in Iraq and Afghanistan, and, there are different sets of rules. And I guess my question to you is, from that experience, if someone plays by a different set of rules than we are, and they're willing to go all out, look, there's a little bit of a value judgment in my values, versus others. Just how do you win against someone who will do anything like you show in the book and start some of these things because the interest into them is, and they're willing to just do something you would never expect, or we couldn't expect, or wouldn't want to do ourselves?
Well, I think I'll start back with kind of some of the things Jim was talking about, which is, if we go back and we look at, how do we avoid these wars? I would say one way is we've always avoided these types of wars, going back to the Cold War with the Soviets, is not because we're appealing to anybody's best interest, but because we're appealing to an enlightened self-interest. What I mean by an enlightened self-interest is, if you think about it, strategies of deterrence, mutually assured destruction, those are acting in your enlightened self-interest. So, if we think of something like the Thucydides trap, in which a rising power is challenging established power, and we go back to, the example of the Germans challenging the British in the First World War, which leads to the Second World War, I think the very obvious conclusion and statement that, that comes out of that historical analogy is that neither Britain nor Germany came out of those wars in particularly strong positions, that the true beneficiary of that war was neither nation that started. It was us. the United States, and that by fully imagining these conflicts and taking them to their logical conclusions, there ultimately becomes only one conclusion you can reach, which is this is not in our interest, the R being the Chinese interest or the R being America's interest. And I would posit once the war begins, that's the moment where you start really behaving and operating with, as you said, Robbie, a separate set of rules. And my experiences of war have taught me that, when you engage with adversaries who fight differently than you do, you should have no expectation that they are going to adhere to, traditional kind of Western law of war styles of fighting. But that being said, I think the macro question here and the spirit behind this book is, how do we avoid this war? Because once the war begins, everybody has lost, at least all of those who've initiated the war. And I will tell you, one of the things that was fun in writing this book and a challenge for me was, obviously the premise of the book is a war between the United States and China. But for a reader and as a writer, for both of us, that's not it puts you in a dilemma. Who wins the war, right? America or China? And if it's one or the other, I would say it's not too interesting. There has to be more of a twist of a why. And I will tell you without ruining the book that neither the United States nor China wins this war. A third party is the beneficiary of it.
So before we, first of all, I want to remind people that they can ask questions as well. And just please either text them or put them in the chat and I'll be texted them. I guess not to ruin anything, but India is a big piece in this whole thing. Maybe Admiral Stavridis, give your thoughts on India. I actually do some business in India. I don't know by 2034 if they're the society that is out there, but maybe just though from a strategic perspective, maybe you have a very positive view on where India is in this entire equation over the next decades.
Yeah. I always say, if a historian 300 years from now sets out to write a history of the 21st century, it won't be about the rise of China. I mean, that'll be part of the story, but I think it'll be much more about the rise of India. And the reason is because of demographics. India is a remarkably young country. It'll overtake China in total population by the middle of this decade. It's increasingly clear that India will orient more toward the West. It already has a vibrant democracy. China does not. At some point, China will face a reckoning for the lack of a democracy. Democracies are like safety valves on a pot that's on a stove. The pot is always boiling. Think about the United States. If you get frustrated with George Bush, the safety valve goes off and you elect Barack Obama. Then you get tired of Barack Obama and you elect Donald Trump. You get tired of Donald Trump, you elect Joe Biden. It's okay. It's messy. It's difficult. Policies change. It frustrates our allies, but it responds to the basic, most fundamental tenet of human behavior, which is that people abhor a boss who just gets to tell them exactly what to do. And if you look at the long throw of human history, it's not on the side of authoritarianism. 100 years ago, there were 15 democracies in the world. Today, depending on how you score it, there's probably 100. And that's going to continue, in my view, because of human nature. So I think China's bounded, limited, at least in its current configuration, whereas I think India's opportunities are much greater going forward. Another way to think of it is China looks like it's on a very smooth road right now. Everything kind of feels like it's going its way. China's road gets bumpy out there because of demographics. They'll get old before they get rich because of gender imbalance in the society, because of the need to remediate, because of a superheated housing market. There's a lot of challenges out there for China, and above all, because they're not a democracy. India's road looks really bumpy right now. That's your point. It's a good one. It's corruption. It's sanitation. It's lack of education. India's road starts to smooth out. And will it come as soon as 2034? I doubt it. But it's it's a marker in the book kind of symbolically of where I think India will go as the century moves on. And by the way, we could all say, I can't imagine India's going to be that advanced by 2034. Fair enough. Finish this sentence with me. I can't imagine 20 jihadists dropping the World Trade Towers. I can't imagine a 20-year war in Afghanistan. I can't imagine a pandemic that locks up the world for a year. There's a lot of things we can't imagine that end up happening. So overall, India plays an important role. I think we've got it about right as you think about the century ahead. Again, maybe the date is off, in this case, a little too soon. Who knows?
So you're both strategic thinkers. Let me put this in the context of SAFE. Right. So here we are, an organization that's thinking about oil dependence in 2004. We've got two hot wars, a global war on terror. And here, we were like, this is crazy. Why are we dependent on one fuel source? And all we do in the United States is debate taste great, less filling, drill more, use less. We said, let's bring military leaders, business leaders to describe why we should produce what we can domestically, diversify fuel sources. And one of the best ways was electric vehicles. And then you bring in autonomous vehicles. And 2 years ago, we said to ourselves, oh man, we're going to be the organization that goes from the frying pan into the fire. Not only do we go from this oil dependence, now the entire solution are these minerals, these batteries, these technologies, AVs, all these things that China had thought about, a decade ago, and we are nowhere on the map and still are not. And that's why we really pivoted in some ways the organization, because what we were thinking about is how do we run the lives that we want, form policy that we want, make the decisions we want instead of being dependent, on others. So I guess that's why the book meant so much to me, and I think to people who we all sent it to, because it really put into context why this matters. And in the United States, it hasn't been for the last 3-4 years where people have been really thinking about this. So I guess in the next 13 years, what do we need to do in the United States to make sure we're not dependent or strengthened? I mean, it's not a total decoupling, but where should we be thinking of these places where we should begin to, bring back our supply chains or reshoring or technology, which technologies matter? So maybe start with Admiral Stavridis, then Elliot, please share your thoughts on this, because we're out there making this argument, minerals to markets every day. We need to be thinking about this on these next 13 years. And then we'll go to some questions in the audience.
Number one, none of this is, I think, rocket science, as the saying goes, or deep seabed mining. I'll come to that in a minute. But this is, first, you have to find new sources. So that means exploration. That means incentivizing that with special tax incentives. It means exploring technologies that can discern minerals from vast swaths of land. So maybe that is using technologies that can be embedded in satellites, that can do broad area assessments. Sometimes this is hypersat kinds of applications. Number three, allies, partners, and friends. Let's build a network. If we're going to go figure out where there are alternative supplies, we have partners who want to work with us on that. Number three, let's get creative. I said a minute ago, this isn't like deep seabed mining, but maybe it is. The bottom of the ocean is full of nodules with cobalt, nickel, copper, manganese. What else is down there? And how could we get at it? Number four, on the how do we use these strategic minerals, rare earths, rare magnetic earths. There are a lot of terms for this. What can we do to the technology so that we use less of them? And then fifth and finally, what about recycling? What can we do about getting these out of carcasses, moving them back? So there's a handful of ideas, all of which I think are gradually coming to vogue. All of it, Robbie, and you know this well, is a result of a broad thinking about what are the strategic supply chains that we simply can't afford to let China dominate. One of them without question is this one, rare earths, let's call them. Another one I think is chips, semiconductors, high-end electronics. Another one is medical supplies. It sounds so prosaic. Remember the start of the pandemic? People were out there looking up on the internet, how do I make a mask? Because we didn't have any masks. I mean, think about that for a minute. So there's a whole series of these. The Biden administration is looking at this, I think, quite coherently. I think you're correct to put rare earths at the very top. By the way, Afghanistan, which we, in my view, would be very foolish to just run out of the exits, has significant potential in this regard, notably in the case of lithium.
You know, I would just note one thing on rare earth. It's not just rare earth; it's actually processing. So,
of course,
people who don't know this, you know, all those, we only process 0 to 4% of any of the minerals and batteries, and we do very little processing of minerals ourselves. And even Australia and others send it all to China. They're basically the choke point of processing. And, you know, we really have to get serious. And I bet you there aren't, you know, 3% of Capitol Hill policymakers who know that there's a difference between extraction of minerals and the processing of those minerals and that choke point. So we have a long way to go, but you know, as usual, the United States, when they wake up, it seems to wake up.
I was just going to make that analogy. It's kind of like the vaccination program. We were sort of behind, and then eventually the industrial capacity kicks in, and now we're opening vaccinations very broadly. We're the largest economy with the highest per capita of vaccinations. And, you know, by 30 days from now, you'll go to a 7-Eleven and there'll be a bin full of syringes. You'll just grab one to get your shot. Probably not quite, but we're pretty good once we get going. And it gets back to a question you asked earlier, Robbie, about what should we be doing about it? And I would argue it's more stabilizing if we have sources. And when I said sources at the top of my little riff there, I meant both sources of the materials themselves and sources of the processing. Yeah, you're correct. China does not, as is commonly thought, has not cornered the market on rare earths. There's a lot of rare earths out there, but processing, yeah, we need to up our game in that regard. Can we do that? Yeah, we can.
Elliot, you know, answer that question, but then maybe just bring in the technology side of this book. And here, you know, we take over the aircraft. We have a lot of arguments now about 5G letting the Chinese into our networks. And just your thoughts about technology and warfare.
Sure. I would just only add on the conversation that was going on before. I think as much as we can cast our energy independence as, you know, as critically being a national security issue, you know, it seems that at least in the last decade, national security has been one of the few areas where we've seen real bipartisan consensus, or at least not vast oscillations between policies. And as much as we can have that type of deep strategic planning when it comes to energy independence and you know, development of future technologies around energy independence, it's only going to be an asset to us. And in the book, you know, the type of sort of near-term planning in 4-year and 2-year increments that's oftentimes endemic in U.S. politics, you know, vis-a-vis a system like the Chinese system, which obviously allows for much more longer-range planning, you know, is something that you know, thematically comes up at several turns. But specifically to what you just asked, Robbie, about technology in the book, you know, one of the central premises from the outset was we knew that cyber was going to play a very big role in the story of this book. As I already mentioned, the sort of precipitating event at the end of the first chapter of the book is this massive cyber attack, and how cyber becomes a real leveling force in the conflict that we've imagined in 2034. So as much as the United States, even today, you know, enjoys, you know, still real dominance in military dominance in the types of conflicts that, you know, we fought in decades past, which are heavy on conventional platforms, whether they be, you know, aircraft carrier battle groups or tank formations, you know, are those going to be the key units in future warfare? And what platforms and what weapon systems will be employed to potentially take away the the advantage we currently at least seem to enjoy. So without giving too much away from the book, I would just offer that, the first aircraft you see in the book is a state-of-the-art F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, but the last aircraft you see doing the essential work in the book is a Generation 1 F-18 Hornet that's probably about 40 years old. So we also see how technology can at times disable you. It can take away your advantage, and an over-reliance on technology can become a real liability for a military. And I think we're seeing that type of sort of over-reliance being something that, in certain parts of the U.S. military, it is being questioned about whether or not it's prudent to be too reliant on GPS-guided bombs or navigation systems that are solely rely on satellites that could be taken out in a cyber attack. So that is stuff that we all get that we go into at some depth in the book.
So I'm going to call on our first person. Maybe if Adam Goldstein can unmute and ask the question himself. If not, I'll just read the question. Adam, maybe introduce yourself and ask the question.
Robbie, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Adam Goldstein, the co-chair of the Energy Security Leadership Council. Thank you both for doing this program today. My question starts with what you've identified as the top issues related to China, being the South China Sea and Taiwan, both of which are geographically local to Asia. And I'm interested in your thinking as to whether those types of issues are precursors to China having a more global hegemonic desire that would play out in later years, or whether you feel that their core interests are really more restricted to their local geography.
Yeah, this is a great question. And I get asked it a lot, frankly, in this context. Oh, Admiral, China has never been an expansionist power. They've never colonized other countries. They've never invaded their neighbors. Actually, they have here and there. But, broadly speaking, through the 5,000 years of Chinese history, that's roughly correct. China has felt itself to be the middle kingdom, meaning they already occupy a superior position above the other mortal countries. They're not quite heaven itself, but they're the middle kingdom between earth and heaven. And that would be, I think, a mistake to say, oh, okay, actually, China's probably just going to localize all this. I'm a big believer in international relations and listening to what people tell me they're going to do. And President Xi has been quite clear about One Belt, One Road, which is a mercantile geoeconomic strategy that, Adam, I know you're familiar with, but for the sake of others, the idea is simple, it's elegant, it's clever. It is to have a massive economy that is essentially manufacturing finished products that are exported, but coming in are all the raw materials that are necessary to complete this virtuous circle. And to do that, you want to secure your trade routes. You want to secure the waterways that lie between you and your markets and your sources of raw material. And China is methodically, intelligently, and quite capably doing so. They now have more warships than the United States of America. Now ours are bigger and more capable and more technologically advanced, but quantity has a quality all its own. They're the largest combatant navy in the world. They are now starting to build bases, sort of traditional bases around the world. They're building aircraft carriers. They're building nuclear aircraft carriers. They're operating extensively with Russia and Iran, two other nations that figure quite largely in the scope and scale of 2034. That gives them reach. We see Chinese warships operating with Russian warships, not where you'd expect them to, if you will, in the North Pacific. They're in the heart of Europe, in the Baltic Sea, conducting exercises together. So I think it is a one belt, one road strategy is a global strategy. It also has a loop that goes over the Arctic. China has many more icebreakers than the United States of America, has worked their way onto the Arctic Council. despite the fact that last time I checked, they have no sovereign territory up there. Stand by for a claim that Admiral Zheng He, who discovered the South China Sea and is the basis for those claims, we're going to hear eventually that he went to the Arctic and that therefore there's a Chinese claim up there as well. I'm being slightly facetious here, but we ought to recognize that this ain't your dad's China, your grandfather's China, or your ancient ancestors' China. This is an assertive global power. Doesn't mean we should go to war with them. Doesn't mean we have to go to war with them. But we need to begin by understanding this is not the China even of 30 or 40 years ago. This is a very different China.
Elliot, did you have anything to add?
No, nothing specifically. I would just continue to beat that drum that the point of this book is to try to imagine how horrible this war would be. Again, we're not predicting that this is necessarily going to occur or this is the direction China is absolutely heading in. But again, in the spirit of trying to do the deep imaginative work to understand how it is in our enlightened best interest to never engage in this conflict, it is also in China's best interest to not engage in it, even as we sort of figure out our respective spaces in this new world.
And by the way, Adam, and you alluded to it yourself, it's not just about geography and real estate, it's also cyber. And here we see China becoming much more assertive, much more aggressive. They've always been quite good at what is broadly termed intellectual property theft, industrial espionage, traditional espionage, which we engage in as well, the United States of America. But China is improving greatly and rapidly in that regard as well. So look for an expansive China, not just here in the real world, but in the cyber sphere as well.
So let's go to our next question. Tom Campbell, would you like to ask the question?
Sure. So hopefully everyone can hear me. So first off, pleasure to meet you, gentlemen, and Admiral Stavridis and Elliot. So I'm curious, in your book, how can we propose diplomatic actions, and what diplomatic actions might we pitch to the Biden administration to obviate some of these most dystopian outcomes in U.S.-China relations? And being a technology person myself, how can technology play into that? I know you've addressed several of these points already in the webinar, but I'm wondering if you might expand a little bit more, especially on this Venn diagram of diplomacy and tech.
Yeah, I'll take a swing at that. Thanks. I think, first of all, and it's inherent in your answer, it is working between the U.S. government and the private sector, in this case, notably Silicon Valley, our tech industries. This is a strong comparative advantage of the United States. They are, unbounded, if you will, and there are some problems with that. And I think there's going to be more attention by the U.S. Congress to finding the best balance between a completely open, free market solution set that exists largely today and some level of regulation. But I think a very important part of working with China is harnessing the energy and the capability of our tech sector. So that could mean not only having U.S. diplomats who are working with their counterparts in China and U.S. military officers who are working with their counterparts. During the Cold War, we had very specific procedures for operating our warships around each other, United States and Soviet Union. These were called the Inc-Sea agreements. Incidents at sea, as in how do we prevent incidents at sea. There are very specific rules about how close a ship could come, how close an aircraft could come, when you could turn on a fire control radar, when you could operate a helicopter. That can be worked between U.S. military and Chinese military, like it was during the Cold War. The diplomacy is the obvious piece. But here's where I want to go. What can our tech sector do? Can we put together a tech delegation that goes to China and has coherent, frank, take the gloves off conversations. Picture Eric Schmidt, former chairman of Google, and Jack Ma, recently sort of tapped on the head by the Chinese, but I think still a significant tech player. Can we bring tech together to describe where the disagreements are and to find the rub points and perhaps try and reduce tensions? And fourth and finally, not to your question, but a very obvious part of this is the economic piece. It is the economic advisors of both nations and the bankers, the private sector actors of both nations. Granted, China has a much stronger thumb on its private sector, but there are still pipes from the private sector in China to the government. I think all of those are fruitful avenues to pursue. I'll close with one other one, which is education and educational exchanges. These are coming under, let's face it, a lot of scrutiny right now, particularly here in the United States. Are there instances of espionage, or are these Confucius Institutes completely separated from the government of China? Obviously, they're not. But education broadly, I think, is another conduit. Sometimes it's called track 2 diplomacy. I'd put tech in a kind of track, if you will, track 3 diplomacy, tech to tech. I think there's some money to be made there.
Elliot, I wanted to get your thoughts on, are you, first of all, an optimist or a pessimist based on, what you've, been writing about? And does this leave you up at night?
Well, I would add, and I think it ties in a little bit to the last question, which is how technology can help us avoid this war, which, also gets into some of the economic interests. And for a long time, it seemed that the conventional wisdom has been that, China and the United States, based off all of our interconnectedness economically, that it would clearly be in neither nation's interest to go to war. Now, people were making that same argument in Europe at the opening of the 20th century with regards to the European powers, that through economic connectedness and even intermarriage amongst the royal families, it was impossible to conceive that there would ever be a war in Europe that had served no one's best interests. Now, listen, we all know how that ended, and in a fit of madness, Europe sleptwalked its way into the most devastating war anyone had seen up until that point, and really a century that was characterized by these massive industrial wars. So we're sort of sitting here right now in the opening years of the 21st century with a somewhat analogous situation where it's so difficult to imagine how either country could enter into a sort of a cycle of collective madness where we would engage in war. And so specifically to your question, Robbie, does it keep me up at night? Am I an optimist? I am an optimist because I believe this is something that in this century we can avoid in much the same way we were unable to avoid it in the last century, that all of those safeguards all exist in the relationship that we have with China. A war would serve no one. But it's important to imagine how bad it would be, and it's important to have the historical context around it, because as much as we know this wouldn't be in anyone's best interests, historically, as a human species, we've had a tendency to march into these types of cataclysmic conflicts. So I remain an optimist, though a cautious one.
So I received a question on my text. I'm going to ask Admiral Stavridis, then I have one pitch for the two of you, and then we can end this. Admiral Stavridis, how much do you think this is about President Xi versus China? Do you think that if President Xi is no longer the leader, he dies or something, like things will change, or is this fundamentally where they're going as a country? And it is.
I think it's the latter, but President Xi is a driver, and he is a powerful, charismatic leader from all I can observe. He has a plan. He is determined. He wants to lift his nation into the very first rank of nations, which in my view, clearly is already there. But he wants a global China that has immense capability, and above all, one that overtakes the United States as the global leader. So I think it's a case of a nation that is on the move with a leader that has great capability, and therefore we ought to pay attention. And particularly, we ought to be paying attention to what President Xi says. He often speaks quite clearly about his objectives.
So all I can say is that as we've gotten into this at SAFE, the more I learn, the more concerned I am, the more concerned about how some of these supply chains are. In some ways, I know it's crazy to say, but maybe COVID came, before it was inevitable that we were too locked in. Now we have a moment where we can step back and begin to rethink some of these things as well. So, same thing with the 6 years of war that the commander said. I was thinking, like, the scariest part of the book is when everyone takes control of everything. So maybe in the next 6 years that can't happen and we won't go to the extreme end of the war. So maybe sooner is better than later. But here's my proposition. So we started SAFE by creating an oil shockwave. Admiral Blair, our chairman, wants to create a critical minerals shockwave. He'd like to show some of these problems that can happen maybe in the near term as our dependence. So as I was reading your book, I was thinking to myself, geez, maybe there's a way to integrate some of the things you've been thinking about, and maybe I have to talk to your publicists, but it would be great if we do a critical minerals shockwave. We can bring some of 2034 into it, and the two of you can participate in some way. How's that sound?
Fun.
Yeah, we could certainly look at that. I'll give you a counter proposal, which is as we write the sequel to 2034, I think this might be something we are going to want to explore. So stay tuned for that as well.
So thank you so much for doing this today. And thank you everyone for listening in to this. And we've sent we've sent everyone here a book. So please, if you haven't read it, please pick it up. It's an enjoyable, though scary read. And if you haven't gotten a copy, please just reach out to us and we can send you a copy right away. Thank you very much to both of you. Speak to you soon.
Thank you. What a pleasure. Thanks, Robbie.
Thank you.